Thank you for joining Effortless Attraction. My name is Evelyn McAleer. I'm the author of A Life You Want, Effortless, and The Woman's Journey. I'm a life coach, business mentor, and inspirational speaker. And my greatest value is making a difference in people's lives. So I hope through these podcasts I can make a difference to your life. I want to thank each and every person who subscribes to Effortless Attraction. If you would like to become a paid subscriber for $1.99 per month, you'll receive exclusive podcasts. Thank you for making a difference. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, whoever can get to listen to this amazing podcast today, Effortless Friendship, with two amazing, wonderful human beings. Today, I am joined by Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll and Jeffrey Olson, two best-selling authors. I actually have the two books behind me in my bookshelf here. Dr. Jeffrey O'Driscoll has written Not Yet, and Jeffrey Olson, the book Knowing. And today, gentlemen, it's Effortless Friendship. And Dr. Jeff, I am going to start with yourself because the story that I know of how you met, you were the first probably to remember the first interactions you both had.
That's true. Jeff Olson wouldn't remember our first interaction because he was unconscious. Jeff was involved in a horrible car crash that I'll let him talk more about if you wish. And I was working as an emergency physician. He was flown to my emergency department. And when I went into the room to see him, I had a profound spiritual experience that he and I couldn't talk about for about a month because he had to have a bunch of surgeries and regain his consciousness before he and I could even visit for the first time.
You know, whenever we're listening, you think when we first met, he was unconscious. And you think, gosh, there's a great way to start a friendship. But isn't it amazing how paths cross? Jeffrey Olson. So one's going to be Dr. Jeff today and the other one's going to be Jeffrey. Jeffrey, do you remember your first interaction with Dr. Jeff?
Well, yes, I do. And the first interaction, because I was unconscious when we first met, was actually from my hospital bed. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Jeff and one of the nurses came in, and I had been in a horrible automobile accident. I was still very sick, but I was well enough that at least we could communicate. And they came in to share with me what they had experienced during the time that they were working on my body and attempting to save my life based on the injuries that I had received in the accident, which were extensive. I mean, both my legs were crushed. My left leg had been amputated above the knee. My back was damaged. My rib cage was damaged. My lungs had collapsed. The seatbelt had cut through and ruptured all my insides. So there was quite a team of surgeons working on me to save my life. Mm-hmm. I was unaware of that until they came into the room and I didn't recognize them. I didn't know them. And that's when they introduced themselves as members of my trauma team. And they shared with me what they had experienced in the operating room, which was not only moving, but very validating based on the fact that I had had a profound experience around the accident, which is referred to as a near-death experience or an NDE. And suddenly, you know, here was this doctor, and we became friends because he was credible. He was a clinician, and there was just an inherent trust. I trusted him. And as he shared what he had experienced in the operating room, I shared what I had experienced outside of my body, if you will. And that's how the friendship began.
Amazing. Dr. Jeff, you know, it took courage to go to Jeffrey Olson himself and to say to him, look, this is what I saw. This is what happened whenever you lay unconscious. Was there a fear in you? Here I am, a physician, a doctor, seen as a professional, and I'm stepping forth to tell this gentleman what I saw that day.
Yes, I was not nearly so courageous as you might think. There was, as Jeff mentioned, I think there was a nurse who also had a profoundly spiritual experience when Jeff arrived in the trauma room. I saw his wife who had died at the scene of the accident. She was there in the trauma room with him, and I experienced her glorious and profound presence in a miraculous way. And this nurse also had a profoundly spiritual experience. And about a month later, she came and started tugging on my arm. She said, "We have to go tell Jeff what happened." Jeff Olson, that is. And I said, "No, we don't." And she said, "Yeah, we have to tell him." I said, "Listen, if you want to go tell a total stranger about your profoundly spiritual experience, be my guest, but I don't feel any obligation at all." But she was a persistent and persuasive nurse, as many nurses are. And she drugged me kicking and screaming up to Jeff's hospital room a month after the accident. And I didn't remember this, but Jeff told me 20 years later, he said, "Yeah, you didn't say much. You just kind of leaned against the wall and nodded occasionally." And I thought, yeah, that's an accurate representation of me. That's probably a correct recollection. And so she told most of the story, and I acknowledged it was true and nodded. But I had this profound feeling. The longer the conversation went on, I had this feeling that my visit was not so much about that day. My visit was to connect Jeff and I to decades of our future friendship and what we would do together later in our lives. I didn't know what it would be at that time. So yes, I was reluctantly courageous, and the nurse drugged me up there and forced me to do it.
I can imagine you were playing it cool. Stand back here, have still be the man here, and I mean, sure, how we're telling the story. Jeffrey Olson, it must have been such a huge relief because, as you say, you had experienced your near death where you went out of body as well. Now I have someone else that, I wasn't making this up. I wasn't imagining that this actually did happen.
Right. Yeah, no, it was very real to me. And of course I was grieving. My wife and my youngest son had been killed in the accident. And of course I was badly battered. And when the doc came in, I hadn't really spoken to many people about what I had experienced. What happened to me is my soul, if you will, left my body. I mean, I knew at the scene of the accident that Tamara, my wife, and my youngest son, Griffin, I knew they were deceased. I knew they were gone. And it was a horrible thing to deal with that. But I had this profound near-death experience where my wife and I had a conversation. I had a 7-year-old son that was going to be okay. He also survived the accident. He was banged up a little bit, not nearly as badly as I was. But we had the conversation. In fact, my wife was telling me, "You can't come with me. You can't stay. You can't stay. You've got to go back. You've got to go back." And we made a deal, that I would go back and raise our son, that I would return, and she was going to remain in that other realm or on the other side, if you will. Now, I hadn't really spoken about that to very many people at all, except my very closest family members. I think I told my mother and my younger brother. And as this rolled out, and here these strangers appeared in my room, and then I find out they're members of the trauma team that worked to save my life. And when Jeff and the nurse shared that they had seen the spirit of my wife who was killed at the accident in the operating room, literally there with us. And the doc said she communicated with me. And of course, I said, "What did she say?" And when she simply shared her gratitude for all that we were doing to save your life. It's just like the bells rang and the light went on. It's like, wow, that's exactly what she would say. And how would he know our conversation? And how would he know that we had made a deal that I was going to come back? And suddenly all these pieces begin to fit among strangers that then, springboard into dear friends, because I knew I could trust him. I knew he was telling me the truth, and everything he shared completely validated this out of body or near-death experience that I had and the conversations that took place while outside of the body that completely aligned with everything that had happened. And it was quite profound.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a word there, Jeff, trust. What a lot of friendships, what good friendships, effortless friendships are built on, that trust. So after the hospital, you have been friends for 20 plus years. if I'm correct. I know you're only young boys, but you have had a lengthy friendship. What was the next stage, or how did the friendship develop, Dr. Jeff?
Well, yes, this is our 25th year since the accident that we've been friends. And after that experience in his hospital room, in Jeff's hospital room, I left him my mobile phone number, which tells you something about the feelings I had about our relationship going forward. When he was well enough to leave the hospital to go to his brother's house for a time to continue healing, he wasn't well enough to go home, but he could go to his brother's house where he had assistants and things set up. And I went to his brother's house and visited with him there. And we had a long and profound talk about things. And then we started meeting for lunch occasionally, and we'd have these long conversations until the server refused to refill our water glasses because they wanted us to leave. And we continued to have these conversations about what Jeff had been taught all his life, what I'd been taught all my life. We had a similar upbringing in neighboring counties, and although we'd never met. And then how did that fit with the experience he had when he was out of his body? So we had a lot of good food for thought, and that went on for many years. And then it came to a point where Jeff was going to move to a different state, and we were having lunch together. And I remember thinking, our relationship's going to change. We're not going to see each other as often. We're not going to talk as much. He's going to be further away. And his deceased wife, Tamara, whom I met that day in the trauma room, came back to me, and she said, "Don't let anything come between you and your friendship with Jeff." That's how important it was that she came back and gave me that message. And so we have kept in very close touch. We speak together often, and we spend time together just as friends, just enjoying one another's company. Because we shared these profoundly spiritual experiences, he was having this most profound goodbye with his wife, just as I was having this profound hello with her. And because we've shared these experiences, we can talk in abbreviated, cryptic sentences, and we kind of know what each other's communicating without having to go into a long explanation like we do with people that don't understand.
Oh, beautiful. Jeffrey Olson, we've talked a lot about the spiritual connection there, Dr. Jeff, and yourself. And there has to be times no matter how spiritual we are or how enlightened or awakened beings that we are, there are tough times that we all go through. How important is your friendship with Dr. Jeff? That we can make that phone call. And actually, I think Dr. Jeff's quite savvy on this, because he does it for me too. I was just thinking about you, and someone reaches out when you most need them. How is that? How important has the friendship been for you on those days that haven't been so great?
It's been very important. And, I have two brothers, and Dr. Jeff had one of his brothers pass away when he was very young. My brothers are still living, and I was very close with my brothers, but Dr. Jeff became that person outside of my immediate family. I could speak to my brothers, I could speak to my mother, but it's different with family. They'd say, "Oh, of course you had this out of body experience." And as the doctor alluded to, a lot of my processing what had happened, and it took years to process it. It did circle around beliefs. Well, gosh, I was taught this, and yet my experience was so unconditionally, love. And we would have these conversations, which within the family and within a conservative Christian community is sometimes difficult. But Dr. Jeff was that safe place that I could go and say, wow, I was taught all my life that God was judgment, that life was a test, that I may be failing the test. And I could run these by him and say, yet in my experience, I experienced love that was unconditional, that had no conditions. There was no judgment. There was nothing like that. And I could put that out on the table during these long lunches and say, what do you make of this? And we could discuss it and we could process it. And it was just a safe place outside of the brothers that I'd grown up with all my life, as a sounding board. Now, how important is the friendship? Even though I had the out of body experiences and these profound connections with the divine and literally conversations with my wife who had passed and everything, I grieved miserably. I grieved as anyone would grieve in losing half the family. And I grieved at attempting to raise, my surviving son, and the process of being in a wheelchair and then eventually being fitted with a prosthetic limb and eventually learning how to walk again. But there was dark nights of the soul during all that. And having been out of the body, I completely lost the fear of death. I had no fear of death. And there were many times I thought, gosh, I just want to go back to that. I was having suicidal thoughts. And there was one particular day when it was very dark. My mood, my demeanor was very dark. And I had actually thought about, well, I could go home and I could accomplish this. And my brothers could certainly raise my son, that I committed to come back into this realm to raise. This conversation in my head. And I was literally contemplating and had actually decided that perhaps I could end it all and go to that beautiful space out of the body and be with my wife who had passed and be with my youngest son who had passed, and that my oldest son could be in good hands. And it was this conversation in my head. Well, when I arrived home that day, there was a small package on the front porch. And I thought, well, that's odd. I wonder what this is. And I picked it up and it was a book. And there was a note from my friend, Dr. Jeff, just saying, hey, I was thinking about you.
Mm-hmm.
You brought that up. Thought you might enjoy this book. And it seems like such a small thing. And I don't want to sensationalize this, but there I was on the brink of potentially taking my life. I was certainly seriously considering it. And this just brought me back to reality, nope, I made a promise. I gave my word I would raise this boy, and I'm here doing it. And I've got support beyond my family. And even in just the simple gift of that book, and the book also had content that was very enlightening to me. It was about drawing close to the divine, which I was missing all of that, having had a peek into it. And that's what friends are for. So yeah, we laugh, we talk. I mean, it's not that we sit and talk spiritual all the time. We've told funny stories about growing up on the farm and riding rodeo and playing football, and we're just a couple of guys that laugh and talk and spend time together. But there are those deeper things when it comes to spiritual conversations or even deeply emotional conversations, where I never said to anyone that I was contemplating my existence and having suicidal thoughts. And yet somehow Dr. Jeff knew and was inspired to bring a book and leave it. And even the content of the book got me through that dark night and back on the path of healing and raising my son and being a father. And at this point, gosh, I eventually fell in love again. I remarried. We adopted 2 boys, which I don't even call my adopted boys. We're just all my sons, and I've rebuilt a life. But Dr. Jeff was instrumental and very important in that process, simply being on the sideline and being a friend.
Dr. Jeff, I was thinking, he's the all-knowing. My own father had passed, and it was a night where I really felt that I was free falling. The only way I could describe it was like a puppet on a string, on strings, and every string was cut, and I was just falling. And that's what it felt like to me. And Dr. Jeff was on the phone that night, and I'll always remember that. Sometimes they say, you don't remember what someone says, but you do remember how they make you feel. And I always will remember that there. So thank you, the all-knowing Dr. Jeff. So guys, with this wonderful friendship, you are now stepping out and helping to bring peace and healing to so many people through you're doing events, talks, your books, out on cruises there. Dr. Jeff, tell us a wee bit about the cruise.
Well, you know how these things come together. I love your phrase effortless, as it applies in some things like this. I had been on a lot of cruises. Well, no, I take that back. I'd only been on one cruise, but I'd been to a lot of medical conferences, and I knew that a lot of medical conferences took place on cruises. It was a good environment for people to gather and visit and so on. And I remember thinking it'd be great for Jeff and I to organize a cruise, and instead of just going to a land-based conference, we could do a cruise and we could have a bunch of people we could meet and help and talk and stuff. And so somebody reached out to me on Facebook. I don't remember how, and we were having a conversation, and somehow this idea came up, and I mentioned it, and this woman said, "Oh, I've been organizing cruises for 20 years. If you bring the guests, the speakers, I'll do everything else." And I thought, well, that sounds like a pretty good deal. So Jeff and I agreed to do it, and she organized this cruise. We had a wonderful 10-day cruise. They gave us this big conference room. They told us we could use it any way we wished while we were on the boat, and we had sessions and we ate dinner together. We had about 60 people that came, and most of them were grieving the passing of a loved one in some stage of grief. And they all brought framed pictures of their loved ones, and we had them all displayed in the front of the room throughout the whole cruise. And I went with Jeff down to the conference room in anticipation of one of our sessions. And he was there a little bit before me, and he came out of the room and he said, "They're there. You have to go in. Go feel it in there." Because Jeff always likes to go in before a conference and get a feel for the place and prepare sacred space. So I went in all by myself, and I sat down in the middle of the room, and I felt the presence of all of these loved ones we were remembering. And it was so powerful. I paused and I said, "What do you want me to tell them?" And they all spoke in unison and said, "Tell them we are one." And so that cruise worked out beautifully. And we got back just not long before COVID shut down the whole cruise industry and the rest of the world. And Jeff had a marvelous experience. You should ask him, let him tell you about the experience he had we were standing on the rail of the boat before we even left harbor from Florida. And he had a great experience. Tell us, Jeff.
Well, gosh, I have little signs or these winks that happen all the time. And it was a beautiful cruise. And it was interesting to be in the energy of those folks that had lost or had loved ones pass. They're never lost, but they feel so gone when they go. My youngest son, who was also killed in the accident, his name is Griffin. And I have these, we have something here in the United States. They're called condors or vultures, turkey vultures. And at one point during my healing, these turkey vultures kept showing up. They kept showing up. They were in the backyard. And then I went up to visit my brother up in the northern part of the state where we live. And there was all these turkey vultures. And I thought, well, that's really odd. And then I was in California and these turkey vultures showed up. Well, I had a friend recommend, well, why don't you look up what that means? This could be a spirit animal of some kind. And so I read about the common buzzard, turkey vulture or condor. And there's different species in that realm. But this specific species that was showing up, I read about the fact that they were actually a sacred bird in ancient Egypt, and that they were sacred because they could soar so effortlessly. That's the word of the day, that they could soar without even flapping their wings for hours and miles, and that they didn't kill anything. They simply ate carrion, and they were revered as a very sacred bird. And then it hit me. It said they were referred to as a griffin bird. Griffin, the name of my youngest son that passed. And I thought, gosh, could these be a sign from him? Could these birds be soaring around when I go do these events and work with those that are grieving as a nod from him saying, I'm with you. I'm watching you, Dad. I'm with you. But the interesting thing about the epiphany of, wow, it's a sign. I went home that night from California and went to bed, and I got up the next morning. And I love to have breakfast outside on the deck and watch the sunrise. And as I got up the following morning after having the epiphany about these birds and the meaning and Griffin, I walked out on the deck, and it was almost as if someone had placed it there. There was this beautiful feather from one of those birds that was just laying right there on the deck, right at my feet. And I picked it up and I knew this is a sign. To cut to the chase, as Jeff and I are in Miami, Florida. That's not, we live in the Rocky Mountains, and I'm usually in the Utah, Idaho, Montana, Nevada area. But here we were in Miami, Florida, on a cruise ship out on the ocean, standing on the rail. And I looked out over the ocean, and sure enough, what would there be but one of these large griffin birds, one of these large condors soaring about. I don't even know if they're indigenous to the area. They must be, but there it was. And again, that was just that nod of, you're doing the right thing. You're assisting people in grief, especially those who have lost children on the cruise. Most of them had children that had passed untimely. And that was a beautiful experience. It's just, I tingle every time I see one of those big, magnificent birds soaring around, because to me, it's my youngest son saying, I'm your guardian angel, Dad. I'm looking out for you. I got your back, and you just keep doing what you're doing, and I've got you.
Yeah, they're lovely. I love those stories. It's just like a good morning. How are you? Beautiful. Well, gentlemen, I'm going to have to start winding things down here. So I'm going to finish off. Dr. Jeff, what do you think is the most important or effortless things, actually, I should say, qualities on having a good friendship?
I think a friendship moves us along a path that brings us a little bit closer to what may be the most important thing we learn in life. Love and empathy. When we have a friend that we know loves us, regardless of the stupid things we do and the mistakes we make, it gives us a safe path to know that we're okay. And when we can move a tiny step in some way toward understanding a friend's difficulties or sorrows or heartaches or joys and rejoicings, it teaches us just a little glimpse of empathy. And I think one of the most important things, perhaps the most important thing we learn in this life, is love and empathy. Because when we have empathy, all judgment stops. When we truly view something from the other person's perspective, we say to ourselves, oh, of course you did that. I'd have done exactly the same thing if I'd have been in your circumstance with your experience and your abilities in that moment. I'd have done exactly the same thing. No, I can't possibly judge you. All I can do is love you. And that's why I think empathy is so important, because our judgment stops and we just have love. And I think true friendship brings us one step closer to that, and then we can apply it to other people in our lives as well.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And ladies and gentlemen, whoever gets to listen to the podcast, if you have not heard tell of these gentlemen, check them out. You'll get more on Jeffrey Olson's story. There's lots of YouTube videos, as there is for Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll. And I'll highly recommend their books, Not Yet by Jeff O'Driscoll, MD, and Knowing by Jeffrey Olson. Gentlemen, I'm going to say to you both, thank you so much for your friendship being in my life, because it makes a difference. It really does. And I appreciate it. I love you both. And I want to thank you so much for your time today.